Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I want to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. DCL serves a broad client base spanning all industries. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Eliot Kimbler, who is a founding and active member of the DITA Technical Committee. Eliot was responsible for the majority of the new proposals in DITA 1.3, although not necessarily the most interesting proposals. He has been working with structured documents and complex markup for over 30 years. He is a founding member of the W3C XML Working Group and the editor of High Times 2nd Edition. Eliot is the founder and primary contributor to the open source DITA for Publishers project and author of DITA for Practitioners, published by XML Press. Eliot lives and works in Austin, Texas. Without further ado, welcome Eliot.
Thank you, Adam. All right, today we're going to talk about DITA for Small Teams, which is a project I started about a year or so ago. And our goal here is to look at how we can provide content management features at a minimal cost when your team is very small and your budgets are low. As Adam said, I've been doing this for a very long time. So today we're going to talk about, what is DITA for Small Teams? What is this project? What are we trying to do? We're going to talk about what it means to, quote, do DITA and what do you need to have in place in order to do that. We'll talk about the DITA for Small Teams approach. How are we going about trying to address these requirements? Talk about some of the different tools that we need to look at. And then if there's time at the end, I'll do a very brief demo. All right, so DITA for Small Teams, which I abbreviate DFST. It's an open source project, and the overall goal of this project is to make it quick and easy for teams to get productive with DITA. One of the things that I've observed over the years is that, teams, especially small teams, 1 person, 2 people, 5 people, 10 people, they say, oh, we're going to do DITA, or somebody tells them they have to do DITA, or they hire somebody in who's like, this DITA stuff is great, we should be doing this, and they're like, great, what do we do? And then they realize, oh, there's all these tools, we have to get all this stuff, it's expensive, we need a content management system, what are we going to do? We'd like to get, one of the frustrations for me as, as somebody who's been one of the developers of DITA and been trying to use DITA for a long time, is that fundamentally DITA is something that you can, in fact, use quick and easily. You don't need to make a huge dollar investment to be productive with it. But the challenge is you have to know how to do that. And that's not always easy. So one of the goals with DITA for Small Teams is to provide some general guidance and some sample code, hopefully clear instructions on how to set things up that can get people started with available open source tools. One of the things that's happened over the last, 10 or 15 years since we first started doing DITA is that the things that you can do with open source tools has improved, so tremendously that, what was prohibitively expensive 10 years ago is now basically free. And so that really changes things in a significant way, and I'm trying to bring that value to the DITA community. The project home is on GitHub, so DITA for Small Teams on GitHub. There's also ditaforsmallteams.org, which will get you to the same place. And part of the goal here is to not necessarily replace your use of full-featured commercial CCMSs if you need them, but to provide a bridge so that, investing tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars is not your cost of entry to using DITA. Get you going quickly, and then let you migrate to more sophisticated tools as you need them and as you can afford them. So what are the general requirements, right? What does it mean to do DITA? Right, you need authoring support. You need something that you're going to use to write your DITA XML documents. That's sort of obvious. you need collaboration management, right? If you're doing DITA, you're almost certainly doing it in the context of a team of people, possibly sharing documents across product lines, across manuals within a product line, perhaps even across lines of business or with different business partners. DITA is all about interoperation and interchange. That means you're going to be working with multiple people. So you have to have some way to manage that collaboration, right? How do you do that? Production management. How do you go from your source files to the actual deliverables that you're putting in the hands of your customers, right? Your HTML files, your EPUBs, your PDFs, your online help, whatever it is. How do you get that? Reuse and link management, right? This is where the real challenge lies within DITA. If you're going to start doing reuse, well, suddenly you're faced with a problem. Well, how do I know what to reuse? How do I know what I have reused? How do I find the things? How do I manage this increasingly complex web of links and documents over time as my content is versioned? These are important questions, and being able to address those reuse and link management requirements is the heart of what managing DITA is about. We'll talk about that in more detail later. And then localization management. So if you're doing any translation of your documents, then you need to manage that translation process, right? The localization workflow and so forth. These are what you need to have in place to do DITA. So then, that brings the question of the day, right? And we see this question being asked all the time by people who are coming to DITA. Do I need a CCMS, right? A component content management system. So DITA authoring support requirements are not trivial, right? DITA brings a lot of sophistication to your content, sophistication that reflects the inherent sophistication of your content, right? If you're documenting a system that uses reusable components and you want the documentation for those components to be reusable, you've got to support multiple output chains. You need to support sophisticated conditional processing in your documents. Those are all, challenging things to do from an authoring standpoint, challenging things to manage from a software standpoint. It's complexity that's inherent in your content. DITA provides features as a standard for representing documents that have those requirements. It provides, standardizes the way you think about it in your content, and it provides some guidance on how you can do the processing for those. But actually doing the work, doing the authoring, doing the management, that's a whole other aspect that DITA standard itself is not going to solve for you, right? CCMS systems, exist to address those requirements, to try to satisfy the challenging support requirements that DITA brings. But at the same time, they're expensive, right? These are sophisticated pieces of software. Many of them have been around for many years. They represent depth of engineering. Commercial CCMS systems can also prevent other challenges, right? Depending on the system that you buy, you may find that not all the DITA features you need are implemented in that system. You're always faced with vendor lock-in. Anytime you buy a piece of software, even if that software is supporting a standard like DITA, there may still be vendor lock-in. There's also the challenge of integrating whatever you buy with other information systems and business processes in your organization. So these are all serious challenges that are inherent in bringing a CCMS system into your environment. And then, of course, your small team budgets are usually limited, right? So one of the challenges with technical documentation is that in most corporations, it's a cost center, right? So, of course, budgets are always limited. Technical documentation never gets any love. And if you're a small team, if you're 1, 2, 5, 10 people, your budget may be extremely limited, and such that, even contemplating a CCMS system is simply not realistic, even if it would be the right thing for you in terms of supporting the work that you need to do. So then you have to ask the question, can lower cost tools meet our requirements? And can you get started with DITA without first having a CCMS in place? All right, I suspect that many of you, listening to this have in fact asked these questions, or maybe asking them right now. So the answer is maybe not. You may not need a commercial CCMS system, or at least not right away, right? It is certainly possible to be productive without a CCMS, right? Which means you can get started with DITA without making that CCMS investment up front. And as I said, some teams may never have the budget for CCMS, even if the cost is justified, right? You might be able to go to your manager and like, look, we had this tool that provided these features. We could save this amount of time. We could, we could do these cool things with our documentation, whatever it is, right? It's not hard to find that justification. But the manager may come back and say, look, dude, there's just, the budget's not there. So, sorry. Now, it is often the case that you can, in fact, justify your CCMS. As data volume or your author community grows to support your localization processes. Once you get started with DITA, show some success with applying this new technology to your complicated documentation problems, you may in fact be able to justify your CCMS. But if the CCMS is a cost of entry into the system, that can be a deal breaker. So that's something that we're trying to address here. We did it for small teams, is to say, all right, you need to do DITA. It's going to be a challenge. Let's see if we can get started quickly with the least amount of upfront investment, show some success, get some experience, understand better how we want to apply DITA to our stuff. Having gained that knowledge, then let's move on and start looking at the more sophisticated commercial tools. All right, so fine. All right, you're going to take my word that I can do this stuff with open source tools. All right, fine. What do I do? Right. So there's a lot of things that could work if you start, searching around for different tools that could, fit these different requirements that you have. You discover there's a whole lot of things. How do I choose a particular tool? How do I hook them up? Right? None of these things are hard, but you have to know what to do. So the goal of DITA for Small Teams project is to provide a sample suite of tools and the DITA-specific configuration details for those tools to get you going quickly. Whether we've succeeded at that yet, I'm not sure, because we're still in the process of getting things together. But that's certainly the goal of the project. All right, so what's our general approach? So for our tools, we want things that are low cost and high value, right? So the lowest cost, of course, is free, at least free from a dollar cost. You want it to be easy to provision and set up, right? So, I mean, a free tool that you can never quite get to work is not really of any value. So you want it to be easy to provision and set up. And you want there to be good community support for users. You don't want to get something in place and then realize that nobody ever responds on the mailing list, right? That's no good either. So we want open source, we want it to be easy to use, and we want good support. For high value, right? We want it to provide the functionality that we need to do it well. There are oftentimes the only option are commercial tools. We especially see that with authoring, which sort of makes sense. All right, so what's my potential tool set? So for authoring, really it's whatever you choose, right? There's a number of options to choose from. Oxygen XML is sort of an obvious choice, but there are other good options as well, right? There's XMetal, there's FrameMaker, there's ArborText Editor. For source control, I recommend Git or its equivalent. We'll talk about that in more detail. For collaboration communication, there's a whole lot of options out there, right? There's things like Jira and Bitbucket, there's Trello, Slack. There are lots of collaboration communication tools out there that are either free or low cost. You can set them up quickly. That, it's really just a matter of picking the one that you like or just using what's already available in your company. For production automation, so here the goal is to, rather than having individual authors producing their outputs directly on their own PCs, is to centralize that processing, offload it from individual computers. Ideally, have it be managed a bit more in the context of your authoring, delivery, approval workflow. There's a number of different continuous integration tools that support that. So Jenkins, Travis CI, Bamboo. There's a number of those out there. And then for the actual production processing, there's the DITA Open Toolkit, of course. There's DITA C. Those are two open source options. There are some other tools as well. For link management, so link management is the thing right now for which there's really no good out-of-the-box open source solution. I'm in the process of trying to implement something that at least shows how it can work. For that, we're using an XQuery database. Right? We're managing XML content. It makes sense that you would implement your processing for it using XQuery as opposed to say a relational database or a NoSQL database. Not the only right answer, but it's an obvious one. There's a couple of good open source XQuery databases exist in BaseX. There's also MarkLogic, which is commercial but really high value. And then on top of that, we need DITA-specific XQuery code to actually understand the link nature of DITA. And I'm currently working on that within the context of the DITA community and the DITA for Small Teams project. If we have time at the end, I can show a very quick demo of where I'm at the moment. Then for translation management, as far as I know, there's no open source solution for that today. So you're really your only choice is going to be one of the commercial systems, something like XTM. They're all good systems. They're all relatively easy to integrate, into pretty much whatever environment. So here's the overall DITA for Small Teams deployment model. So on the left, you've got an author's workstation. They're managing their source code in a local Git repository. They're using whatever authoring tool they're using. They're using some sort of Git client to manage, the source code control, check in, check out, branching, whatever it is they're doing. Then they also have a web browser to connect to the link management web application that's going to provide them with the link management features that they need. On the right-hand side, you've got the server. So the presumption here is that you've got a team of people. They're going to be using a shared server or some set of shared servers to share code, do collaboration, and so forth, and also do our output processing. So we have a central Git repository. Lots of ways to do that here. I've shown GitLab because that's what we're currently looking at setting up as part of the sample DFS DITA for Small Teams implementation. But again, there's a wide variety of tools that could go there. You could just use GitHub. You can use Bitbucket. You can use Slack from Atlassian. For output production, you've got a continuous integration server. CI stands for continuous integration there. Something like Jenkins or Travis CI. That's going to actually produce your outputs. We have commit hooks that are part of the versioning repository, and those communicate with the XQuery database and our link management application to keep that up to date. So it's not too complicated. All these pieces are pretty well easy to provision and set up, and then it's just a matter of hooking everything together. Now, all these components can all be on a single machine. So, for example, if you were, basically an author working as a team of one, you can put all these things on one laptop without having to, actually have a separate server. But we're presuming that most people have a team size, greater than one. For deployment, we're starting to look at Docker as a technology to simplify things even farther. So Docker is a relatively new technology that basically lets you have package containers that can run software. Basically, they're virtual machines that you can manage in a distributed way. You can download them quickly and easily, run them, hook them together. It's a really exciting technology. So some other members of the DITA for Small Teams project are looking at how to set up all the components you saw in the picture before as a set of coordinated Docker containers, with the idea being that you could just follow the instructions that we give you, set up your Docker environment, download and run these things, and boom, you've got a system ready to go. So make it even easier for people to use. Well, we're still in early days getting this together because all of us are working on other things in addition to this. But this is the vision here, at least my vision, is basically you just run a couple of download commands and your DITA for Small Teams environment is ready to go. And then, in the context of a system tailored for your specific uses, you can use that as a basis and a guide, and people can set up what they need. Docker is open source, can run on any platform, so that helps make things easier as well. Check the time here. All right, talk a little bit about authoring tools. So there are some free or open source authoring tools. None of them are that satisfactory, but there are plugins for Eclipse. There's Emacs XML mode. Their DITA features tend to be limited. They could be challenging to set up and configure. I mean, my basic feeling is if you're doing heads down authoring of DITA content, it really only makes sense to invest in a commercial tool because the value is simply so high. And none of these tools are prohibitively expensive. Right? I mean, the analogy I make is, your auto mechanic, they're not going to Harbor Freight to buy the tools that they use to work on your car, right? They're going to Snap-on. Same idea here. So if there's any place that you invest real dollars into your tool set, the authoring tools is the right place to do that. These are usual suspects are all good. Oxygen XML is the only cross-platform offering, so it's the only one that runs, on Windows and OS X and Linux. Collaboration management tools. So Git are better for source code control, and I make a point of focusing on Git because it provides some version management features that are really a much better fit for what you need to do to manage DITA content and hyperdocuments in general than other tools, other version control systems like Subversion. So Git provides what we can call true distributed version control. I have to say, it's what all the cool kids are using, which is definitely true. It's well supported. There's free and low-cost cloud solutions for GitHub. So if you need a shared GitHub server, lots of ways to do that. There's good client support, lots of free tools that you can use. And really, this is the important one, is it's a good match to the versioning needs for complex hyperdocuments, and particularly the use of branches and so forth. I don't have time in this presentation to go into that in more detail, but I talked about this in a paper that I gave at the Balasage conference back in August. So if that was of interest to you, you could find that paper and understand a bit more of why the use of Git in the context of managing complex hyperdocuments, which is what DITA documents are, is really important. So for production automation, we want to use a continuous integration tool. So continuous integration, the basic idea there in the software environment is that, every time you commit, changes to code, on a branch that, means this stuff is ready to test, that your system is going to go run the tests and do that all the time, so that, every hour, every day, what the state of your code is from a integration and testing standpoint. These tools are general processing, process automation, scripting, management tools. So you can use them to do anything, and so we can apply them to DITA processing in particular. Typical way that these work is they integrate with your source code control repository. So you commit something to your master Git repository. The continuous integration system sees that the new commit has been made. That triggers a job to go off and do whatever it needs to do. Regenerate the PDFs, regenerate the HTML or your online help files, whatever it is, so that those are then available for you. You don't have to manually think about, oh, I changed these 5 topics. Let me go regenerate my my PDFs or whatever. Of course, you can integrate these with the DITA Open Toolkit, and they're going to report success or failure. They can maintain generated files for history, so you could say, well, what did this look like, 2 weeks ago when somebody checked in this one file. Certainly if you're in a company that's doing hardware or software development, they've got any kind of software activity going on, you're going to have a continuous integration system already available to you. Something like Jenkins or Hudson or Bamboo. If you're not in that environment, it's easy to set up continuous integration systems locally, or just use an available web service. Right. So Jenkins, Hudson, Travis CI, Bamboo. Those are the names that'll come up the most often. There are some free or low-cost cloud offerings. So, for example, Travis CI is free if it's connected to a public GitHub repository and integrates with GitHub nicely. New one is Bitnami. These things are changing all the time. When I first started doing this a year ago, I was using something called CloudBees, which was free. Now it's not free, right? These things change all the time. So you just got to, use Google. Continuous integration tools, I mean, they're pretty easy to provision on your own server, pretty much download and install. Or if you want to put it on a cloud server, like on an Amazon or Microsoft cloud server, that's not too hard either. Deliverable generation, right? DITA Open Toolkit, DITA-C, those are really your main tool options. Most people are just going to be using the DITA Open Toolkit. For the most part, you want to be able to run these on Linux. So, I say avoid Windows-only solutions unless you can provision a Windows server for automation. So, for example, if you're going through Microsoft and their Azure web services, their cloud server option, you can provision a Windows through there. Otherwise, you're pretty much going to be stuck with Linux. Link management tools, right? So this is the fun part because this is where we don't really have good open source solutions at the moment. But it's really the important part, and it's this aspect of the challenge that may lead you to choose a commercial CCMS system that provides the link management features you need, and decide that an all open source solution is simply not sufficient because this component doesn't yet exist. As I said, I'm in the process of trying to implement something that maybe can work here. Right now, that's a spare time project, so progress is slow, but I do have some code that I can show you at some point. So the basic idea here is that we're using an XML database as a search server. So the authoritative version of our source files, of our data source files, that's in our Git repository. We're going to use the XML database as a read-only server, and we set up the system so that the XML database always reflects the current state of our source. It can support high-quality search. It can support link management through some DITA-specific function packages. That's the stuff that I'm currently working on implementing. And we can integrate with source code control systems through commit hooks or through our continuous integration system. So it's not too hard to get everything hooked up. The real challenge is implementing that fourth bullet, implementing the DITA-specific link management functions and making that both work efficiently and provide things in a way that authors find useful. From an XQuery database standpoint, there's two open source databases, Exist and BaseX. They're both good tools. They're both well supported. Both have nice features. Currently, I'm using BaseX simply because it was a little bit easier for me to configure DITA DTDs to use with BaseX than with Exist. That's really the only reason. MarkLogic is the main commercial XQuery tool. It's expensive, but it's really high value. And you may already have a license for that within your company. There may be a lot of people use MarkLogic for website delivery, or else for big data management. Some people are using MarkLogic as in the same way they would use a NoSQL database. So you may already have it there. You would need MarkLogic if your data volumes were really high. That's probably not going to be the case, in a real small teams environment. But I mention it because it is an option. I mean, if your company already has a license for MarkLogic and you're allowed to create databases in it, then that would be the right thing to use. All these tools are easy to set up and use, no problem there. Data link management XQuery libraries, these are the projects that I'm currently working on. This is where my code is going. The main goal here is to answer the where used question, right? Given that I have a topic or an element in a topic or a submap, what other topics or maps refer to that? Who's using me, right? If I can't answer that question, then I can never really know for sure what the dependencies are within my content. If I change this topic, if I create a new version of it, who will I break? What other publications will break if I do this, right? So answering that where used question is really the essential question in link management. There's other things I'd like to know. Once we can answer that where used question, we've already collected enough information so we can do a lot of other interesting things around the link aspects. Who do I link to? Who links to me? What are the kinds of links? Which links are topic rests? Which links are content references? Which links are cross-reference links? which links go outside my content to external web pages, which links go inside my publication, which links go across publications. The system I'm building now provides all this content through web forms using a pretty crude web application. It's all exposed through a REST API, so it could be integrated with authoring tools without too much difficulty. I haven't tried to do that yet. Could be done. Wouldn't be too hard. All right, translation management. As far as I know, there's only commercial options for translation management. So XTM is the one I'm most familiar with. I know there's some other options out there as well. XTM, as an example, has a very straightforward integration API. So it would be easy enough to integrate that into the rest of these DITA for small teams tools using, for example, your continuous integration server or using the same commit hook mechanisms that I'm using for the link management database. Now, if you have strong localization requirements, right? I mean, if like, you're translating into 40 languages and translation is really an essential part of what you're doing in your technical documentation development, that may be sufficient to motivate the use of a commercial CCMS. Because once you bring translation into the mix, right, your workflows, your version management, your dependency tracking, the coordination required, it really ramps up. So, I don't want to suggest that, oh, well, we can just handle this translation stuff in this, larger, open source mix, right? The translation stuff is serious. You want to take it seriously, and that may require a CCMS that already has good integration with translation management tools, already has, good support for the translation workflows built in. Maybe not. Depends on your budget. All right. So what are some of the challenges here, right? So of course there's no free lunch. So we're trying to keep the cost low from a dollar standpoint, right? The basic starting premise here is that we have a small team, limited budget. We want to get going quickly and easily. We don't want to spend a year trying to provision our tools and justifying our budget. But that doesn't mean that it's completely free, right? So somebody's got to set the tools up and keep things running. Git style version control can be a challenge, right? Especially if you're used to older ways of doing version control like Subversion or Perforce, things like that. Git can be a real, it requires a shift in the way you think about versioning. There's a little bit of a challenge there. Also, the focus in Git on branching takes some getting used to. My experience has been that people, especially in documentation as opposed to in software, nobody's ever been in a situation where they really had to learn and understand branching. But branching is really important. Git makes branching not just easy, but almost essential. But again, that takes a little getting used to. And of course, you have to be careful as you manage your source, right? With any powerful tool, it's always, there's always the potential for, going off the rails and getting things in a mess because you have, too much power. Git's certainly there. So you need to be careful. You need to understand what you're doing. Not try to get too clever. And of course, here I think this is probably, perhaps I should have a whole slide on just this one bullet, right? The distributed nature requires good team communication. So Git itself as a technology distributes versioning in a way that older, more centralized systems like Subversion don't. That's powerful, but it also provides some opportunities for things getting out of sync. What that means is that there really has to be good team communication. In fact, for this kind of approach, or really for collaborative data authoring to work at all, there needs to be good team communication. That's just always true. The difference is that this approach really makes that obvious. One of the things that I've observed over the years is managers in particular seem to, desire, and it's a reasonable desire, to say, well, if we can bring in some software that can manage this stuff, then we can avoid the inherent challenges in having the people on our team communicate with each other, right? That is, the CMS can automate the communication aspects that are inherent in doing collaborative authoring. My experience has been that it doesn't really work, that there's really no substitute for good team communication, and that if you build good team communications, if you have a culture of communication, if you have processes in place, if you have practices that build good team communication, that even people working with the crudest of tools will be able to be successful and work well. Without communication, even with the best tools, things go wrong because communication is essential. So I've actually come over the years to prefer systems that emphasize and motivate person-to-person communication rather than try to hide it. I realize that communication is hard. I mean, I'm the sort of person who hates to actually ever talk on the phone. So, it's hard. But there's no substitute for communication well. The other thing I'll observe is that agile methods and agile methodologies also depend very heavily on good communication. So as we see this trend of trying to apply more and more agile methods both to software, hardware development, as well as to documentation development, again, that really motivates the need to have good communication, to have a good culture of communication, to have practices for communication, good tools for communicating. So tools like Slack or using Jira effectively, those become really essential parts of this project, of this kind of environment. Nothing really to do with managing the actual data source, really just enabling the communication that's required to make these things work. In the environment that I've shown you here, in this Data for Small Teams environment, where we're pulling together entirely independent tools and just plugging them up to kind of cobble together this environment that will hopefully work for us, there's no central management user interface, right? There's not necessarily just one place you can go. Whereas a commercial CCMS usually tries to provide a single point of entry for all the functionality. That can be a problem. For some teams, it's not a problem. For some people, it might. And then, of course, individual users may need to set up more stuff than you otherwise would have, right? Now, one of the things we're trying to do, our goal with using Dockers is to minimize the amount of stuff that an individual user who's going to participate in one of these Data for Small Teams environments would have to do. Hopefully we can succeed at that. But right now you might have to download 2 or 3 different things, set them up, configure your editing environment properly, configure your source code management tool properly. So that's a cost to be aware of. I mean, if your team is small, right, 2 or 3 people, you got to just sit around a table and make it work. But as the size of your team increases, the incremental cost of having to manage each user's environment gets higher. You need to take that seriously and consider that carefully. And that's one of the reasons that we're really hopeful that Docker can address that aspect of the problem as well. Right, requires communication. I forgot I actually had a slide on this. I do have a complete slide on this. Anyway, I won't repeat what I just said about communication, except that communication is really perhaps the most important aspect of this, irrespective of the technology details. Right, the technology is going to change over time. Your ability to communicate within your team, that's never going to change. The tools you might use to communicate might change, but the need for communication and the human aspects of that are not going to change. And I'll just make a plug for Slack. Slack is a tool that's only been around, gosh, maybe at most a year. I started using it in a couple of different contexts. I found it to be tremendously effective relative to all the other tools that I've used over the last 20 years. So if you haven't looked at Slack, I suggest you do. All right, Data for Small Teams reference configuration. There's a bunch of options. We just had to pick one. The tools that we've chosen reflect the biases or the preferences of the Data for Small Teams developers, right? Which is mostly me. A few other folks have started contributing, which is good. We just pick some stuff for whatever reason. So no magic to any of these choices. Really, our intent here is just to demonstrate that the approach can work. In your environment, you may pick a completely different set of tools for whatever reasons you have, because it's what you've got, it's what you know, whatever the reasons are, it doesn't matter. Really, the key here is we just want to show how you can do it, once you see how it can work, it's usually pretty easy to adapt that to whatever the set of tools is that you actually pick. The sample DFT setup that we're currently approaching, Oxygen XML for authoring, Git, probably through Bitbucket for source control. We may end up using a tool called GitLab, which is basically a competitor to Bitbucket but provides a local version that you can run on your own server. That might be interesting. Jenkins in a Docker container as our continuous integration. BaseX is our XML database for link management, and we're not trying to address localization support. So you see, this is just a selection of tools from the many that are available. No magic to this at all. All right. So if you're going to set this up, it should be possible to get something set up in less than a day. All these tools are easy to install and download. If we get our Docker thing going, then it should be really easy. And the DITA for Small Teams provides how-to instructions. I will warn you, I have not been able to get the instructions as complete and up to date as I had wanted at the time I wrote these slides. So if you go there, it's not going to be as much as I had hoped, but there's still some guidance there. If you're trying to do this and you don't see what you need, please feel free to contact me or post to the DITA users list. You know, it's always good to know somebody's trying to do something, and that motivates us to spend more time on this. If you want to learn more, you can go to the DITA for Small Teams project on GitHub. Like I said earlier, the landscape changes really rapidly. New tools come and go, things change. So, you know, Google search is your friend. Your corporate IT group may already provide some or all of these tools. Like I said, especially for continuous integration and source code control, those are probably already there if you're doing software hardware documentation. All right, so let me look at the time here. I think we have time for a very quick demo. What I'm going to show you, this is very much work in progress, not as complete as I had hoped it would be, but you know, life gets in the way. So what I'm going to show you is the link management component that I've been working on. And just to set some background, what I've got is I've got a couple of sample projects that are just, you know, different kinds of DITA documents. So you can here see I've got a couple of maps and some topics. Nothing too excited about this. These files are managed in a Git repository. So here you can see this command window. I've got a little Git repository. I've got some files that have been modified, but I haven't committed them. I'm gonna commit these files. Some changes, usual informative commit message there. And what we're going to see is when I do these commits, this is going to, what you're seeing here, these messages are from my Git commit hooks that are updating the XQuery database with all the files that have changed. So now I'm going to go to my little link management application. And this is running on top of the BaseX XQuery database. It's a very crude web application. I am not a web designer by any stretch. I've been focusing on the data processing part of this, but at least gives you an idea of how it might work. So what you can see here is each Git repository and each branch on that repository is managed as a separate link management database. And let me just remind myself what I did here. I am on branch develop. Okay. So here, if I go to my develop branch, I can see a list of all the files that are in this branch. And I'm going to update my link management indexes. So I'm making sure that I'm seeing the latest stuff. All right. And so now what you're seeing here is a reflection of everything in the database. And you can see I've got some maps. And here's all the maps. And I know, for example, here in this column says route map, whether or not a map is a route map or is not a route map. And then we look down a little lower, and you can see here's all the topics. And so this is a link management database. What I'd like to know, for example, is where is something used? So let's take a look at this. Like here, we see submap 1, and I can say, where is submap 1 used. So I'm going to get my submap link, and you can see this is telling us that submap is used within publication pub2 did a map. It's used by a topic ref within the navigation tree, and so forth. Likewise, I can come down here to a topic, and here we'll just take task 1, and we'll say where is task 1 used. And we can see the task 1 is used from submap 1. It's used within the navigation tree. So this is just to demonstrate that I have in fact gathered the link management information, the link information about all these files, and I can present it in different ways. For my maps, I can see the navigation tree of my map. This is not a very interesting one, but we can see there's a navigation tree. I can see the map tree. Let me look when it has some submaps. So here we can see this is a map, and it has one submap, and I can look at the map. I can see the source and so forth. So I can, for a map, I can look at the key spaces. So I know about the keys that are defined in the map, and I can see, what they link to and properties and so forth. So this is just to show you that I do actually have some code running that is starting to build up the link management knowledge, and from that we can build appropriate functionality. Now this is still very, very early. There's a lot of functionality that's not here that I'd like to have, but it does show you that there is a path forward. All right, and that is the extent of my demo. So we have time for questions.
Hi, Eliot. Thank you very much for this informative webinar. The first question that has come in is, have you ever seen cost justification to move from unstructured to structured for a lone writer?
To move from unstructured to structured for a lone writer. Gosh, I mean, I would think that the cost justification is sort of inherent in why would you do it any other way? But I guess the short answer is no, but only because that's not something that I would normally ever be involved in. I mean, basically, the justification is once I start doing things using structured rather than unstructured content, I can make my life as an individual much easier, right? I can start taking advantage of all the power that the tools give me, right? I can push a button, I can generate PDFs, HTML, different PDFs, different HTML. I can start managing, more documents on my own. I can do things that I couldn't otherwise do in an unstructured environment. I mean, if you're a single writer, I mean, I would think I would be more inclined to just do it, knowing that it will make my life easier rather than trying to justify it to somebody. I mean, I guess if I had to get approval for the cost of my authoring tool license, I guess that would be it. But otherwise, it just seems it seems like a no-brainer to me. But I mean, I've been doing this so long that it's difficult for me to imagine not doing it in XML, and certainly not doing it in DITA. So I'm not sure I can provide a useful answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Eliot. The next question that's come in is, which authoring system would you recommend for a startup DITA project? I did a startup DITA project at Health Level 7 back in 2009, 2010. I used Oxygen, and Toychoice SVN is a mini content management system. It was a challenge. I also tried the DITA Open Toolkit and XML Mind, which was a free version, but it was too complicated. Using Oxygen, I found worked best.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that I'm a big Oxygen fan. So I typically would recommend Oxygen as your starting point, right? I mean, in terms of authoring support, cross-platform support, integration with the DITA Open Toolkit, support for new features, I think it's unmatched. Now, having said that, the latest versions certainly of XMetal and of FrameMaker are also quite good in terms of their polish, their support for DITA. XMetal certainly integrates with the DITA Open Toolkit. FrameMaker not so much, right? Because Adobe has their own, point of FrameMaker is you can generate PDFs and other things from it. But even with FrameMaker, you can still integrate with Open Toolkit pretty easily. Certainly between 2010 and now, things have improved in all the tools. The DITA Open Toolkit has improved. The documentation for the Open Toolkit has improved. Certainly with the 2.x version of the toolkit, the team has put a lot of work into making it easier to run, easier to configure. The out-of-the-box plugins are better and so forth. And also the community has grown as well, so that the knowledge that you have to draw on is better. So I think that would be, my recommendation would be pretty much, use Oxygen. If you've seen in my slides, I'm recommending using Git rather than Subversion for version control. But use of Subversion is not a deal breaker. But if you had to choose, I would say there's no reason to choose Subversion over Git today. You should choose Git. And yes, I think that actually answers the question.
Thank you, Eliot. The next question that came in is, using SVN as a CMS, I missed the management UI. What else do I miss compared with a Git style version control tool?
So SVN, the issues that I have with SVN are more about the way it does versioning and the fact that it requires this centralized server. Git provides is optimized in a couple of ways. One, by having distributed repositories, you can use Git locally, even if you never have a central repository, right? So with Git, you can make any directory into a Git repository just on your machine. Boom, it's version controlled. That alone is really powerful. Another thing that Git provides is very lightweight branching. So Subversion, when you create a branch, you're making a copy of all those files, right? So that means doing branching is very expensive. In Git, a branch is just a set of pointers to files. The files themselves are not copied. So in Git, branching is very lightweight. That ends up being very powerful. Another way that Git is optimized is in the way that it communicates files over a connection. So with Git, it only has to, so with Subversion, when you have a remote repository and a local working copy, it has to compare each file byte by byte to determine whether the files have changed. That's very expensive both from a time standpoint and from a communication over the wire standpoint. It just takes a long time. Git, by contrast, just checks the hashes for each of the files, right? So it's very quick for it to determine whether your repository is in sync with some remote repository. And then when it transmits data over the wire, it's only transmitting the differences. So it's very efficient to use over the network. Git is also very efficient for managing binary objects because Git only stores a given file once, right? It never makes a copy of it if it hasn't changed. So that makes it much more appropriate for managing things like graphics and media files that you would almost never manage in a Subversion repository because it just, trying to manage graphics, big graphics in a Subversion repository, it just brings it to its knees. With Git, it's not a problem because as long as those files don't change at the byte level, Git never makes a copy of them. So it's highly efficient in that way. There's some really nice GUIs for Git. Source tree provides a nice comprehensive user interface for Git. That's sort of the power user Git user interface. There's integrations with Windows Explorer, with Finder under OS 10, you like Tortoise Git, for example. There's also just Git for Windows. So there's pretty good, pretty good UI support there. Now, like I said in my earlier slide, there's not going to be a single management user interface over this whole thing, right? That's one of the things you get with a commercial CCMS system. So, that's an aspect you have to be aware of. But for the most part, you should just be, checking things in, maybe creating the odd branch, maybe doing the odd merge of a branch from time to time. But for the most part, your use of the version control system for typical authoring workflow should be pretty straightforward and routine. I mean, for example, if you're documenting a complex software product and that software product itself is doing lots of complicated versioning and branching and hotfixes and so forth, well then that's a whole other kettle of fish. But I'm not sure that there's anything that can really help in that situation except just knowing what you're doing and working carefully.
Thank you, Eliot. Several more questions have come in, the next being, some SQL databases support XQuery. Have you considered any of those XQuery-only databases?
Well, that's what I'm using for the link management component is XQuery databases. So BaseX and Exist are both XQuery databases. MarkLogic is an XQuery database. But I'm only using those in read-only. I'm not using them to manage the source code itself. I want to do that in Git. There's a number of reasons for that, which I certainly don't have time to go into. But basically, there's no good. Your XQuery databases are not going to provide the versioning features that you need to actually manage your source code day to day. So we're just using them as an implementation optimization for doing the link management stuff. But I'm not sure that actually answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Eliot. Next question has come in is, are there plans to extend link management to graphics?
Are there plans to extend link management to graphics? It could certainly be done. I mean, I haven't, in the code I've worked on so far, I haven't really done anything with, for example, topic refs that point to graphics or dealing with image elements and what they reference to. There's nothing that prevents me from doing that in my code that I've written. I haven't really gotten there yet. For those graphic formats that are themselves in HTML, SVG in particular, it would certainly be possible to manage links in there in the same environment. Again, it's just a matter of writing the code to do it.
Great. Thank you, Eliot. The next question has come in is regarding CI. Is there a way to intelligently build maps based on the topics that change in the merge? Or do you have to brute force build all maps regardless of what topics have changed?
Yes. So the question is there a way to only rebuild those topics that actually need to be rebuilt? So the short answer is, in practice, no. And the reason is that the web of dependencies between the data processing that happens between your source code and the final output is so complicated that being able to determine what had actually changed and what needs to therefore be rebuilt in order to reflect those changes would be computationally difficult. And so in practice, it's just easier to republish everything. Right now, if your publications are relatively small, hundreds or thousands of topics, that's not a big deal. If you're looking at tens of thousands of topics, because basically you're managing an entire website, an entire large website as a single DITA publication, that's another aspect of it. If you simplify the problem by simply not doing certain things in your DITA, or like not using conditional processing in a certain way, or not using content references in a certain way, so that that certain problems that are hard simply won't occur, then you probably could automate some sort of incremental republishing and here we're talking specifically about HTML, right? Because that's the only environment where it makes sense, right? Because there's basically a mapping from topic to HTML page. For PDF, I mean, you just have to rebuild the whole thing. So it's certainly possible. Most DITA users never have that kind of scale problem where the cost of implementing the incremental update would be worth the value it would bring. It's just easier to buy a bigger computer or just provision more servers so that production time is not an issue. But I realize there are some environments where that simplistic just throw hardware at it approach is not enough. Certainly the DITA Open Toolkit has not been architected in a way that would make incremental update and rebuilding easy.
Thank you, Eliot. Two more questions. The first of which is, how do you roll out this system to your team? Are there any specific training resources?
How do you roll the system out to your team? There's certainly no training resources that are currently being provided as part of the DITA for Small Teams activity, partly because we just haven't gotten there, and partly because, you know, it's way outside the scope of what I've been attempting to do in the short term. If we can get the Docker thing going, which we should be able to do once we focus on it, that should simplify the actual deployment of software onto individual tools. Individual users' machines. But in terms of training people on how to use it, that's really the same training problem you have with any set of tools. So like, for example, for the authoring tool that you choose, all those products, if you go to the vendor of that product, they can point you to training resources, people who can provide that training. For the rest of the stuff, you probably just have to put it together yourself, or hire somebody to put it together for you. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for that at this time.
Thank you, Eliot. The last question has come in is, when will Volume 2 of DITA for practitioners be available?
I'm sorry, we're out of time, Adam.
Sure.
That's my bad answer to that question. The short answer is, as soon as I start writing it, it'll be done sometime after that. But I have to do second edition of Volume 1 first to reflect it in 1.3. Then I can work on Volume 2.
Okay. Well, thank you, Eliot, for this wonderful webinar, and thank you, everyone, for attending. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the archive section of our website located at www.dclab.com. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, October 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Content Engineering and the Internet of Smart Things, being presented by Mark Lewis, content engineer and DITA educator over at Quark. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
All right, thank you.